Look at the phone in your hand, the car in your driveway, the food in your pantry. We think of these things as products of peace and progress. But what if I told you many of them have a secret history? A history forged in the middle of the largest conflict the world has ever seen. It was a time of unbelievable destruction, but it was also a time of frantic, desperate invention. When your life and the lives of millions depend on solving a problem right now, you get creative. You find solutions in unexpected places. You take a technology meant for tracking enemy planes and use it to heat up a sandwich. You take a failed glue and realize it can save a soldier's life on the battlefield. This wasn't innovation for profit. It was innovation for survival. So how did a global war, a period of pure necessity, end up shaping our modern, everyday lives in ways we barely recognize? What mundane objects that you use every single day started as a desperate attempt to gain an edge in a fight for the world? The answers are sitting in your kitchen, in your closet, and in your garage. They are hidden in plain sight. Number 20, how did a failed glue become a lifesaver? It was an accident. Most of the great discoveries are. In 1942, a man named Dr. Harry Coover was working for Eastman Kodak. His job was to create a new crystal clear plastic for gun sights. He was experimenting with a family of chemicals called cyanoacrylates. But he ran into a problem. The stuff was a complete failure for his project. It was incredibly sticky. It bonded to everything it touched, instantly and permanently. He couldn't get it off his equipment. Frustrated, he shelved the formula and moved on. It was a useless, annoying substance. The war continued. Years passed. In 1951, Coover was working on another project. This time, he was trying to develop a heat-resistant material for jet canopies. He was working with a colleague, Fred Wohler. Wohler decided to test the old cyanoacrylate formula again, thinking it might have the properties they needed. He put a drop of it between two expensive glass prisms in a lab instrument called a refractometer. The prisms immediately and permanently glued together. Wohler's experiment was ruined. The expensive lab equipment was destroyed. But in that moment of expensive frustration, Coover had a flash of insight. He finally saw the potential. This wasn't a failed plastic. It was a revolutionary adhesive. He didn't call it superglue at first. The initial name was Eastman Nin 110. The military saw its potential during the Vietnam War, long after World War II had ended, but the initial discovery was a direct result of wartime research. Medics in Vietnam reportedly used cyanoacrylate spray as a temporary way to stop bleeding in wounded soldiers. They could spray it directly onto an open wound. The glue would seal the tissue in seconds, holding the soldier together long enough to get him to a hospital. It wasn't a perfect solution. It could cause skin irritation and wasn't sterile, but it saved lives. After the war, the technology entered the consumer market. In 1958, Eastman 910 was rebranded and sold as superglue. Its ability to form a powerful bond without heat or pressure was unlike anything people had seen. It could bond metal, plastic, rubber, and even human skin, as many of us have accidentally discovered. Today, we use it to fix broken coffee mugs, repair toys, and men's shoes. A more refined medical-grade version called Dermabond is now used by surgeons around the world to close wounds without stitches. It's a direct descendant of that battlefield spray. An entire industry of instant adhesives grew from a failed experiment to create a better way to aim a gun. It's a strange path from a wartime lab to the junk drawer in your kitchen. The glue that failed to help build weapons ended up helping to heal people instead. But what if Harry Coover had just thrown out his notes in frustration back in 1942? Are there other failed wartime experiments sitting in forgotten files that hold the key to future technologies? Could the original less refined cyanoacrylate formula have long-term health effects on the soldiers it was used on that we still don't understand? Number 19, could a children's toy really have come from a warship? Sometimes genius comes from watching something fall. Richard James was a naval mechanical engineer. In 1943, he was stationed at the cramped shipbuilding yards in Philadelphia. His job was to develop a new kind of meter. This meter would monitor the horsepower on battleships. The ships were rolling and pitching on rough seas, and they needed sensitive instruments that could stay stable. James was working with tension springs. One day, he accidentally knocked one of the springs off a shelf. He watched as it didn't just clatter to the floor, it gracefully walked. It arced through the air, landed, and then seemed to step from one end to the other. The idea stuck with him. It was mesmerizing. He saw something more than just a piece of naval equipment. He saw a toy. He spent the next year experimenting. He tried different types of steel wire. He worked on finding the perfect tension and the right dimensions. His wife, Betty, was skeptical. She saw piles of wire and springs. She didn't see a product. He needed a name. Betty thumbed through the dictionary and found the word Slinky. It's a Swedish word meaning sleek or sinuous. It was perfect. With a $400 loan, they had a local machine shop produce 400 of the toys. They had a hard time convincing stores to carry it. No one understood what it was. Finally, in November 1945, just after the war ended, the Gimbel's department store in Philadelphia agreed to let them demonstrate it. They set up a ramp on a counter. Richard James put the Slinky at the top and let it walk down. A crowd gathered. They were captivated. In 90 minutes, they sold all 400 Slinkies. The toy was a sensation. The Slinky wasn't a direct military invention the way a weapon is. It was a byproduct. It was born from the mind of an engineer trying to solve a military problem. The materials and the understanding of physics came from his work on warships. Without the pressure of the war to create sensitive marine instruments, Richard James would never have been in that workshop, with that specific spring, at that specific moment. The Slinky has since been used by teachers to demonstrate the properties of waves. U.S. soldiers in Vietnam used them as makeshift radio antennas. It was inducted into the Toy Hall of Fame in 2000. Over 300 million have been sold. It's a simple coil of wire. But its journey started on the deck of a rolling battleship, but we have to wonder what other everyday objects were inspired by a moment of accidental discovery in a military lab. Are the simple principles behind the Slinky's movement still being studied for more complex applications in robotics or energy absorption? Could a different type of metal from that naval yard have produced a toy with entirely different and perhaps more useful properties? Number 18. Why did a chocolate candy get a hard shell? War is hot, and chocolate melts. This was a real problem for soldiers. They wanted a taste of home, a small comfort. But a chocolate bar in a pocket in the South Pacific or North Africa quickly turned into a gooey mess. Forrest Mars Sr. of the Mars Candy Company saw this problem firsthand during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. He observed soldiers eating small chocolate pellets encased in a hard sugar shell. The shell kept the chocolate from melting in their hands and in the heat. It was a simple, brilliant idea. When World War II began, Mars knew this was his opportunity. He went into partnership with Bruce Murray, the son of the president of the Hershey Chocolate Company. Hershey was a competitor, but they controlled the supply of rationed chocolate. The partnership was essential. They combined their last names to create the product M&Ms. For Mars and M for Murray, they received a patent for their manufacturing process in March 1941. The U.S. military became their first and biggest customer. M&Ms were included in sea rations for soldiers. They were heat-resistant and easy to transport in their cardboard tubes. They provided a quick energy boost and a morale lift. For many soldiers, it was their only sweet treat for weeks on end. The company's slogan, "Melts in your mouth, not in your hand," wasn't just clever marketing. It was a direct statement of its original purpose, born from a military need. When the war ended, the soldiers came home. And they brought their taste for M&Ms with them. The candy had a built-in customer base of millions of veterans. Mars bought out Murray's share in the company and began marketing the candy to the general public. Production ramped up, and what was once a military-exclusive treat became a global phenomenon. The original cardboard tube was replaced by the familiar brown pouch in 1948. The famous M wasn't stamped on the candies until 1950. The peanut version came along in 1954. But the core invention, the hard candy shell that protected the chocolate, was a direct solution to a wartime problem. But what would have happened if Forrest Mars hadn't seen those soldiers in Spain? Would a melt-proof chocolate ever have been invented for the consumer market? Are there specific chemical compounds in that original candy shell designed for extreme durability that we haven't fully analyzed for other uses? How much did the government's massive initial orders shape the candy industry for decades to come? Number 17, how did we end up spraying everything from a can? The enemy wasn't always human. In the Pacific Theater, soldiers faced another constant threat: insects. Mosquitoes carrying malaria and other diseases were responsible for a huge number of casualties. It was a serious logistical and medical problem. Traditional methods of pest control, like draining swamps or using handheld sprayers, were inefficient and slow. The U.S. Department of Agriculture was tasked with finding a better solution. Two researchers from the department, Lyle Goodhue and William Sullivan, developed the solution in 1941. They were looking for a way to disperse insecticide as a fine mist over a large area. Their breakthrough was to create a small pressurized portable can. They mixed the insecticide with a liquefied gas, a fluorocarbon that was under pressure. When a valve was open, the pressure forced the mixture out as a fine spray, an aerosol. It was a tiny, handheld fog machine. Their invention was nicknamed the bug bomb. The military immediately recognized its value. Over 40 million bug bombs were sent to troops during the war. They were used to clear tents, barracks, and even airplane cabins of disease-carrying insects before troops entered. It dramatically reduced the incidence of diseases like malaria and dengue fever. The invention was credited with saving countless lives. It was considered so important that Goodhue and Sullivan were awarded the Army-Navy E Award for their contribution to the war effort. After the war, the technology was declassified. Companies saw the immense potential for a consumer product. But the original bug bomb was a heavy, high-pressure steel can. It wasn't suitable for home use. A company called Planalp, a name few people know, invented a cheaper, lighter valve. This made the mass production of low-cost aluminum aerosol cans possible. In 1947, the first consumer aerosol products hit the shelves. So they weren't bug sprays, they were air fresheners. Soon, the technology was adapted for everything. Hairspray, whipped cream, spray paint, deodorant, shaving cream, WD-40. The list is endless. The can that was designed to kill mosquitoes in a jungle tent now sits in almost every bathroom and kitchen cabinet in the country. It all started with the need to protect soldiers from a tiny, deadly insect. But what were the long-term environmental consequences of releasing millions of those early fluorocarbons into the atmosphere? We know about CFCs now, but what did we not know then? Are there other, safer propellant technologies developed for military use that have not yet been released to the public? Could the very principle of aerosolization be adapted for more efficient drug delivery systems beyond simple inhalers? Number 16, can a car be more than just a car? The U.S. Army knew it had a problem. As the world edged closer to war in the late 1930s, its primary vehicle was the motorcycle, and sometimes a modified Ford Model T. These were not vehicles for a modern mechanized army. They were unreliable, they got stuck in the mud, and they offered no protection. The Army needed something new. It needed a light, rugged, four-wheel drive reconnaissance vehicle that could go anywhere. In 1940, the Army issued a demanding set of specifications to 135 different automakers. The vehicle had to have a wheelbase of no more than 75 inches, a height of no more than 36 inches, weigh no more than 1,300 pounds, and be able to carry 600 pounds. And they wanted a working prototype in just 49 days. It was an impossible deadline. Only two companies responded seriously, American Bantam Car Company and Willys Overland. Bantam, a small, struggling automaker, was desperate. They hired a freelance designer named Carl Probst, who drew up the initial plans in just 2 days. They built their prototype by hand, scrambling for parts. They delivered it to the Army just in time. The Army loved it, but they were worried Bantam was too small a company to produce the vehicle on the scale they needed. So they gave Bantam's blueprints to Willys Overland and Ford. They told them to improve on the design. Willys put a more powerful engine in it, the Go Devil. Ford perfected the mass production process. The result was a hybrid design, but the vehicle that went into mass production was primarily the Willys Overland model, the MB. Ford also built them under license, calling their model the GPW. Soldiers fell in love with it. It was tough, reliable, and versatile. It could cross rivers, climb mountains, and navigate dense forests. It served as a command car, a troop carrier, an ambulance, and a machine gun mount. War correspondent Ernie Pyle wrote that it did everything. It had no personality, and it had 100 personalities. The origin of the name Jeep is debated. Some say it came from the Ford model name, GP for general purpose, slurred together. Others say it was named after a popular character from the Popeye cartoons, Eugene the Jeep. Whatever the origin, the name stuck. Over 640,000 were built during the war. When the war was over, Willys Overland trademarked the Jeep name. They created a civilian version, the CJ2A, and marketed it to farmers and ranchers as a replacement for the tractor. It was the first mass-produced four-wheel drive vehicle for the civilian market. It created an entirely new category of automobile, the sport utility vehicle or SUV. Every SUV on the road today, from a Ford Explorer to a Toyota RAV4, owes its existence to that rugged little military vehicle born out of desperation in 1940. But how different would our modern automotive landscape be if Bantam had been a larger company and had been able to fulfill the contract alone. What specific design elements from the original blueprints were lost when the larger companies took over? Are there military vehicle technologies being developed now, focused on autonomy or new fuel sources, that will eventually become standard in our personal cars? Number 15, how does simple green tape become the universe's go-to fix? Ammunition boxes were a problem. They were cardboard sealed with a thin paper tape. The tape was backed with a weak adhesive that you had to wet, like a postage stamp. In the damp, humid conditions of the battlefield, the tape would fail. The boxes would leak. Water would ruin the ammunition. It was a small problem that could have deadly consequences. Vesa Stout was a worker at the Green River Ordnance Plant in Illinois. Her job was to inspect and pack ammunition cartridges. She had 2 sons serving in the Navy, and she worried about them constantly. She saw the faulty seals on the ammo boxes every day and knew it was a danger. She came up with a solution, a strong cloth-based tape that was waterproof. She brought the idea to her bosses, but they dismissed it. Frustrated, Stout did something remarkable for a factory worker in 1943. She wrote a letter directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. She laid out the problem clearly and explained her solution in detail. "I suggested we use a strong cloth tape to seal the boxes," she wrote. "It should be waterproof. They could open it by pulling a tab." The letter landed on the president's desk. He saw the simple brilliance of the idea and passed it to the War Production Board. The order went to Revolite, a division of Johnson & Johnson that made medical adhesive tapes. They developed a new tape based on Stout's idea. It had 3 layers. The top layer was a thin sheet of waterproof polyethylene. The middle was a strong fabric mesh. The bottom was a thick, rubber-based adhesive that would stick to almost anything. It was colored olive drab to match military equipment. The soldiers loved it. It was strong, waterproof, and they could tear it with their hands. They called it duck tape. Some say because it repelled water like a duck's back. Others say because the cloth mesh was made from duck cloth. They used it for everything: repairing tents, patching boots, fixing equipment, even as a makeshift bandage. After the war, the GIs brought their love for the versatile tape back home. There was a huge housing boom, and a new use was found for it, sealing the joints in heating and air conditioning ducts. The color of the tape was changed from olive green to the now iconic silver to match the metal ductwork. The name slowly shifted from duct tape to duct tape. It became a staple in every toolbox. Its use by NASA astronauts to improvise a carbon dioxide filter on the Apollo 13 mission cemented its reputation as a problem solver of last resort. It all started because a concerned mother wrote a letter to the president. But did Vesta Stout ever receive formal recognition or financial compensation for an idea that created a multi-billion-dollar industry? What are the chemical properties of the original adhesive that made it so effective, and could they be replicated for more advanced applications? If the tape had been introduced for its civilian purpose first, would it ever have gained the legendary reputation it earned on the battlefield? Number 14. What does a soda pop have to do with a naval blockade? Before the war, Germany was one of the biggest markets for Coca-Cola outside of the United States. But when the war began, trade routes were cut off. A naval blockade by the Allied forces stopped the shipment of the secret syrup concentrate used to make Coke. The German bottling plants were about to go out of business. Max Keith, the head of Coca-Cola's German division, was in a tough spot. He couldn't make Coca-Cola, but he had factories, workers, and a distribution network. He needed a new product. He decided to create a new drink using whatever ingredients he could find. This was wartime Germany, and resources were scarce. He used the leftovers from other industries. This included things like apple fiber from cider presses and whey, the liquid left over after making cheese. The ingredients were inconsistent and changed based on what was available. He needed a name for this new concoction. He told his team to use their imagination. In German, the word for imagination is fantasy. A salesman named Joe Nip immediately suggested the name Fanta. It was short, catchy, and derived from the core idea of the project. Fanta was born. It was a yellowish, cloudy drink. The flavor was different from batch to batch, but it was sweet and fizzy. It became incredibly popular in Germany during the war. It was one of the only non-alcoholic beverages available. It kept the bottling plants running and saved the company. When the war ended, the parent Coca-Cola company took control of the German plants again. They discontinued Fanta. But the story wasn't over. In the 1950s, Pepsi started to expand its product line. Coca-Cola executives decided they needed a competitor to their own flagship brand. They remembered Fanta, they reformulated the recipe, this time with a reliable supply of high-quality ingredients. They created a new orange flavor. The revived Fanta was launched in Italy in 1955 and then introduced to the United States. It was a huge success. Today, Fanta is sold in over 190 countries and comes in hundreds of different flavors. It's a global brand. But it started as a desperate improvisation, a way to keep a business alive using the scraps and leftovers of a country at war. But how different was the taste of the original wartime Fanta compared to the orange soda we know today? Are there any surviving bottles or written records of the exact formulas used? Could a modern company successfully create a product based on the principle of using only locally available leftover ingredients? Number 13, how did a quest for better radar give us a hot pocket? The war in the air depended on radar. Being able to detect enemy aircraft at a distance was a critical advantage. British scientists John Randall and Harry Boot were working on improving radar technology. In 1940, they developed something called the cavity magnetron. It was a device that could generate powerful short-wavelength microwaves. It was a massive leap forward. It allowed for the creation of small, lightweight radar systems that could be installed in airplanes. This technology was so important that it was shared with the Americans in a secret mission. The American company Raytheon was given the contract to mass produce the magnetrons. An engineer at Raytheon named Percy Spencer was an expert in radar technology. He was a self-taught genius who held over 300 patents. One day in 1945, he was standing in front of an active radar set. He was testing a magnetron. He had a chocolate bar in his pocket. He noticed it had melted. He was intrigued. He wasn't the first person to notice that microwaves produced heat, but he was the first person to wonder what he could do with it. He decided to run an experiment. He sent a lab assistant out to get a bag of popcorn kernels. He placed them in front of the magnetron. The popcorn exploded all over the lab. The next day, he tried it with an egg. The egg cooked so quickly that it exploded, covering a colleague's face in hot yolk. Spencer realized he had something big. He had found a new way to cook food using microwave energy. Raytheon saw the potential. They filed a patent for a microwave cooking process. In 1947, they built the first commercial microwave oven. It was called the Radarange. It was nothing like the ones we have today. It was 6 feet tall, weighed over 750 pounds, and cost about $5,000, which is over $60,000 in today's money. It had to be cooled with running water. These early models were used in restaurants, hospitals, and military canteens. It took another 20 years for the technology to become small enough and cheap enough for home use. The Amana Corporation, a division of Raytheon, introduced the first countertop microwave oven in 1967. It changed the way we eat. It all started with a melted chocolate bar in a radar lab. But are there any subtle long-term health effects from decades of low-level microwave radiation exposure in our kitchens that we have yet to identify? What other military-grade energy sources, like the magnetron, are currently being researched for applications we can't even imagine? Could the original high-powered Radarange have cooked food in a way that is fundamentally different from modern, lower-powered ovens? Number 12. Why do pilots wear those specific sunglasses? In the 1920s and 30s, aviation was changing. Airplanes were flying higher and faster than ever before. This created a new problem for pilots. At high altitudes, the glare from the sun was intense and unfiltered. It caused headaches and altitude sickness. The standard flight goggles were bulky, they fogged up, and they didn't offer enough protection. The U.S. Army Air Corps Lieutenant General John McCready was a pilot who had seen a friend damage his eyes during a flight. He contacted a company in Rochester, New York called Bausch & Lomb. He asked them to create a new type of eyewear for pilots. He needed something that would block the sun's glare, reduce eye strain, and provide a clear field of vision. Bausch & Lomb developed a prototype in the late 1930s. They created a lightweight metal frame. The key innovation was the lenses. They were large and slightly convex. This shape followed the contour of the human eye, blocking peripheral light from entering. The lenses were tinted a specific shade of green, which they found was best at filtering out blue and yellow light, reducing haze and sharpening focus. They called this new product the anti-glare. The military designated them the AN-6531. Pilots started calling them aviators. When the United States entered the war, aviator sunglasses became standard issue for pilots and air crews. They weren't just a piece of equipment, they were a symbol. Photos of famous generals like Douglas MacArthur wearing his aviators on the beach in the Philippines turned them into an icon of American strength and coolness. They were part of the heroic image of the fighter pilot. After the war, the style crossed over into civilian life. Bausch and Lomb rebranded them as Ray-Bans because they banned the rays of the sun. They became a fashion statement. They were worn by movie stars, musicians, and presidents. From Marlon Brando in The Wild One to Tom Cruise in Top Gun, the sunglasses have never gone out of style. The design has remained largely unchanged for over 80 years. It is a perfect example of form-following function. What was created out of pure military necessity became a timeless piece of fashion, but what specific optical properties of that original green tint made it so effective, and have those properties been perfectly replicated in modern lenses? Are there advanced optical coatings developed for military visors today that could one day become the next generation of sunglasses? How much of the aviator's enduring popularity is due to its functional design versus its cultural association with military heroism? Number 11, can you rebuild a society without rubber? Rubber was a critical resource. It was needed for everything. Tires for trucks and airplanes, hoses for gaskets, boots for soldiers. But in 1942, the world's supply of natural rubber was cut off. The Japanese military had captured the countries in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia and the Dutch East Indies, that produced over 90% of the world's rubber. The United States was facing a crisis. It had a stockpile, but it would only last about a year. Without rubber, the Allied war machine would grind to a halt. The U.S. government took drastic action. It instituted a national speed limit of 35 miles per hour to conserve tires. It started a massive rubber recycling campaign. People were asked to turn in old tires, raincoats, and garden hoses. But it wasn't enough. The only real solution was to create a synthetic substitute. The science wasn't new. German scientists had developed a form of synthetic rubber in the 1930s, but the American process needed to be different, and it needed to be scaled up at an incredible speed. The government brought together a consortium of 4 major rubber companies: Firestone, Goodyear, B.F. Goodrich, and U.S. Rubber. They were fierce competitors, but they were forced to share their patents and research. They worked with oil companies and universities. It was a massive, coordinated national effort. They developed a process for creating a material they called government rubber styrene, or GRS. It was made from 2 chemicals derived from petroleum butadiene and styrene. The government funded the construction of 51 new synthetic rubber factories. These plants were built and began operating at a breathtaking pace. By 1944, just 2 years after the crisis began, U.S. production of synthetic rubber had grown to over 800,000 tons a year. That was more than double the amount of natural rubber the country had imported before the war. It was one of the great industrial achievements of the conflict. After the war, the synthetic rubber industry continued to grow. The new material was cheaper and in some ways more durable than natural rubber. It could be engineered to have specific properties like resistance to oil or extreme temperatures. Today, about 70% of the rubber used in the world is synthetic. It's in the tires on your car, the soles of your shoes, and the seals in your refrigerator. The massive industry that makes modern life possible was born out of a desperate 2-year scramble to replace a resource lost to war. But what were the environmental impacts of building and running those 51 factories in such a short period of time? Are there any lost or forgotten formulations of synthetic rubber from that frantic research period that could be superior to what we use today? How did the forced cooperation between competing companies change the landscape of American industry forever? Number 10, how do you carry fuel without spilling it? Carrying fuel was a messy, dangerous business. The standard fuel cans used by the British and American armies were flimsy and poorly designed. They were made of thin, welded steel. The seams would split. They required a funnel to pour from, which was easily lost. They required a wrench to open. The lids leaked, spilling flammable gasoline everywhere. They were so bad that soldiers nicknamed them flimsies. The German army, however, had a brilliant solution. Their fuel can, the Wehrmacht-Einheitskanister, was a masterpiece of simple, functional design. It was created in 1937 by an engineer named Vinzenz Grunvogel. The can was flat-sided and rectangular. It was made of stamped steel, with welded seams for strength. It had 3 handles. This meant one soldier could carry 2 cans in one hand, or 2 soldiers could carry 1 can between them. It had a large spout with a simple, quick locking cam lever that didn't require any tools. It had an air pipe that ran from the spout to an air pocket at the top of the can. This allowed air to enter as the fuel was poured out, preventing the glugging that caused spills. and it was designed to float on water when full. The Allies first encountered these superior cans during the North African campaign. They immediately recognized how much better they were. They captured as many as they could and used them. An American engineer named Paul Pleiss was in London and managed to get his hands on one. He knew the Allies needed to copy it. He sent it back to the United States. The U.S. military reverse engineered the German design. They made a few minor changes, but kept all the key features. This new American-made can was called the jerry can, a slang term for the Germans. The jerry can was a game changer. It allowed fuel and water to be transported safely and efficiently to the front lines. It was crucial for the fast-moving, mechanized armies of the later war years. General Eisenhower is quoted as saying, "Without these cans, it would have been impossible for our armies to cut their way across France." After the war, the design became the global standard for portable fuel and water containers. The plastic gas can in your garage is a direct descendant of that original German design. It is a rare example of one side in a conflict adopting their enemy's technology, not because it was a weapon, but because it was simply a better way to solve a fundamental problem. But who was Vinzenz Grunvogel, and did he ever know the global impact of a simple invention? What other examples of superior non-weapon technology were ignored or overlooked by the opposing side during the conflict? Could the Jerrycan's design principles of durability and efficiency be applied to create better storage containers for other critical materials like medical supplies or food? Number 9. What if a common mold could change medicine forever? The discovery happened in 1928. A Scottish scientist named Alexander Fleming came back to his lab after a vacation and found that one of his petri dishes, where he was growing Staphylococcus bacteria, had been contaminated with a mold. He noticed something strange. In a clear circle around the mold, the bacteria were dead. The mold, Penicillium notatum, was producing a substance that killed bacteria. He called this substance penicillin, but Fleming had a hard time isolating and producing it in large quantities. His discovery was mostly ignored by the medical community for over a decade. When World War II began, the need for a drug that could treat bacterial infections became urgent. Soldiers were dying not just from their initial wounds, but from the infections that followed. A team of scientists at Oxford University, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, picked up Fleming's research. In 1940, they proved that penicillin was effective in treating bacterial infections in mice. The next year, they treated their first human patient. It worked, but they quickly ran out of the drug. The problem was still production. Growing the mold was slow and yielded only tiny amounts of penicillin. Britain was being bombed nightly. Its factories were dedicated to the war effort. Florey and Chain knew they couldn't produce penicillin on the scale they needed. So, in the summer of 1941, they traveled to the United States. They went to a government research lab in Peoria, Illinois. They presented their findings and asked for help. The American government, realizing the immense potential, launched a massive coordinated effort. They brought in pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Merck. The breakthroughs came fast. A researcher named Mary Hunt, who was nicknamed Moldy Mary, found a new, more potent strain of penicillium on a cantaloupe she bought at a local market. Scientists developed new deep fermentation techniques that allowed the mold to be grown in huge vats, not just in shallow dishes. By 1943, they were producing enough penicillin to treat all the Allied wounded. The drug was a miracle. It dramatically reduced the death rate from infected wounds. It treated pneumonia, strep throat, and other deadly bacterial diseases. D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, in June 1944, was the first major military campaign in history where penicillin was widely available. After the war, the drug became available to the public. It ushered in the age of antibiotics. It has saved hundreds of millions of lives. The initial discovery was made in a London lab, but it was the massive, government-led industrial effort of the American war machine that turned a scientific curiosity into a world-changing medicine. But what if Mary Hunt had not bought that specific cantaloupe on that specific day? How many other potent strains of antibiotic-producing molds exist in nature, still undiscovered? As we face a crisis of antibiotic resistance, could the same kind of massive government-led effort that produced penicillin be used to find the next generation of life-saving drugs? Number 8. How did a fabric for parachutes change the way we dress? Before the late 1930s, the primary material for women's stockings was silk. It was expensive and delicate. Most of the world's silk came from Japan. As tensions between the United States and Japan grew, it became clear that this supply chain was not secure. A brilliant chemist named Wallace Carothers, working for the DuPont company, had been experimenting with creating a synthetic fiber. In 1935, he created a polymer that could be drawn into a strong, fine thread. He called it Fiber 6 to 6. DuPont was looking for a splashy name for this new material. They settled on nylon. The first major consumer product made from nylon was women's stockings. They were introduced to the public at the 1939 New York World's Fair. They were a sensation. They were stronger, cheaper, and more durable than silk. When they went on sale nationally in 1940, women lined up in the streets to buy them. But this new fashion trend was short-lived. When the United States entered the war in 1941, the government took over all production of nylon. The material was too valuable for the war effort. It was the perfect material for parachutes. It was stronger and more resistant to mildew than the silk that had been used before. It was also used to make ropes, tents, tire cords, and flak jackets. All the nylon produced in the country was dedicated to military use. Civilians could no longer buy nylon stockings. This created a huge pent-up demand. For years, women had to go without or paint seams on the backs of their legs to simulate the look of stockings. When the war ended in 1945, the nylon factories switched back to civilian production. The return of nylon stockings was a major event. It symbolized a return to peace and normalcy. When the first post-war shipments hit the stores, it caused riots. Crowds of thousands of women would line up for hours, hoping to get a pair. These events were known as the nylon riots. The war had proven the versatility and durability of nylon. After the war, it was used in hundreds of new products. It was used to make carpets, toothbrushes, fishing lines, and clothing. The fabric that was created as a substitute for silk and then repurposed to help win a war ended up becoming one of the most widely used synthetic materials in the world. But what would have happened to the fashion industry if the war had not interrupted the supply of nylon stockings? Are there other advanced military textiles developed during the war that never made it into the consumer market? How did the government's total control over a material like nylon shape the post-war economy and consumer expectations? Number 7, how can you fly in a bomber at 30,000 feet? Flying at high altitudes was a huge strategic advantage. It allowed bombers to fly above enemy anti-aircraft fire and bad weather. But it was also deadly for the crew. Above 10,000 feet, the air is too thin to breathe properly. The lack of oxygen causes hypoxia, a condition that impairs judgment and can lead to unconsciousness and death. The cold is also extreme. Early high-altitude crews had to wear bulky, heated flight suits and uncomfortable oxygen masks. They were constantly at risk of frostbite and equipment failure. The solution was to create an artificial environment inside the aircraft. The idea was to pressurize the cabin, to pump air into it to simulate the atmospheric pressure of a lower altitude. The concept wasn't new, but making it work in a large military aircraft was a massive engineering challenge. The fuselage had to be strong enough to withstand the pressure difference between the inside and the outside. It had to be perfectly sealed. Any crack or leak could lead to a catastrophic explosive decompression. The first military aircraft to feature a fully pressurized cabin for the entire crew was the American B-29 Superfortress bomber. It was developed during the war and entered service in 1944. Its advanced pressurization system allowed the crew to work in relative comfort at altitudes up to 35,000 feet. Back, they could wear light clothing and didn't need oxygen masks for most of the flight. This reduced fatigue and improved their effectiveness. The B-29 was one of the most technologically advanced aircraft of the war, and its pressurized cabin was a key part of its success. After the war, this technology was immediately transferred to the civilian airline industry. The first commercial airliner with a pressurized cabin was the Boeing 307 Stratoliner, which actually flew just before the war but in very small numbers. After the war, the technology became standard. Companies like Boeing and Douglas used their experience building pressurized bombers to create a new generation of passenger planes. Pressurization allowed airliners to fly high in the jet stream, where there is less turbulence and better fuel efficiency. It made air travel faster, safer, and more comfortable. Every time you fly in a modern jet, the comfortable climate-controlled cabin you are sitting in is a direct result of the technology developed to protect bomber crews at high altitude. But what were the physiological effects on the first crews to spend long hours in these artificially pressurized environments? Are there any sealed military reports detailing accidents or failures during the development of this risky technology? How much faster did commercial aviation develop because of the immense wartime investment in high altitude flight? Number six, what does canned meat have to do with victory? Feeding an army is one of the biggest challenges of war. The food needs to be nutritious, have a long shelf life, and be easy to transport and prepare. In the late 1930s, the American company Hormel Foods had a product that fit the bill. It was a canned meat product made of chopped pork shoulder and ham. The head of the company, J. Hormel, needed a name for it. He held a contest at a party and offered a $100 prize. An actor named Kenneth Daigneault came up with the name Spam. It was a portmanteau of spiced and ham. When the United States entered the war, the military needed a source of protein that could be shipped all over the world. Spam was perfect. It was shelf-stable and came in a convenient rectangular can. The U.S. government purchased over 150 million pounds of Spam for the troops. It was part of the Lend-Lease program, which supplied food and equipment to allied nations. It was sent to Britain and the Soviet Union, where food was severely rationed. It became a staple food for both soldiers and civilians. For the soldiers, Spam was everywhere. They ate it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was fried, baked, and eaten cold out of the can. Some soldiers grew to hate it, making up songs and jokes about the ubiquitous canned meat. But it was a reliable source of calories that kept them going. In a letter of thanks to Hormel, future Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev wrote that without Spam, we wouldn't have been able to feed our army. Margaret Thatcher, who was a teenager in Britain during the war, remembered it as a wartime delicacy. After the war, the GIs came home, but Spam's journey was not over. It had been introduced to cultures all over the world. In places like Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines, where it was introduced by American troops, it became a beloved part of the local cuisine. Spam musubi in Hawaii is a classic example. The meat that fed the Allied armies became a staple in pantries from London to Seoul. It is a peculiar culinary legacy of the global conflict. But what were the exact ingredients and preservation methods used in the wartime version of Spam, and how do they differ from the product today? How did the massive government contracts for Spam affect smaller meat producers and the American food industry as a whole? Are there any long-term health studies on the populations that consumed large quantities of Spam during and after the war? Number 5, how did a broken pen change the way we write? The fountain pen was a disaster in the air. At high altitudes, the lower air pressure would cause the ink to leak out, creating a terrible mess. Fighter pilots and bomber crews needed a reliable writing instrument that would work under any conditions. A Hungarian newspaper editor named Laszlo Biro had been struggling with this problem for years. He was frustrated with his fountain pen. It smudged, it leaked, and he had to constantly refill it. He noticed that the ink used to print newspapers dried almost instantly. He tried to put this thick, pasty ink into his fountain pen, but it wouldn't flow. He had an idea while watching some children play with marbles. A marble rolled through a puddle of water and then left a clean, wet line on the dry pavement. He realized he could use a tiny ball bearing at the tip of a pen. The ball would rotate, pick up the thick ink from a cartridge, and roll it onto the paper. He and his brother Georgi, who was a chemist, developed a working prototype. They filed for a patent in 1938. When the war broke out, the Biro brothers, who were Jewish, fled to Argentina. They found a new investor and started a company to produce their new pens, but they were still a niche product. The British Royal Air Force heard about this new pen. They were looking for a solution to their leaky fountain pen problem. They ordered 30,000 of Biro's pens. The ballpoint pen was perfect for air crews. It didn't rely on gravity, so it could write upside down. It didn't leak at high altitudes. It was a small but important piece of technology that made the job of navigators and pilots a little bit easier. An American salesman named Milton Reynolds saw the pen in Argentina. He knew it was a brilliant idea. He flew back to the United States, made a few small changes to the design to get around the patent, and started producing his own version. He called it the Reynolds Rocket. In October 1945, just after the war ended, he started selling his pen at Gimbel's department store in New York. The advertising claimed it was the pen that could write underwater. On the first day, thousands of people lined up. Gimbel's sold its entire stock of 10,000 pens at $12.50 each. The ballpoint pen craze had begun. Other companies jumped in, the price dropped, and the cheap, reliable, disposable ballpoint pen became the most common writing tool in the world. It all started with the need for a pen that wouldn't leak in a bomber. But what happened to Laszlo Biro? Did he ever receive the full credit and financial reward for his invention? Are there any design elements from his original RAF pens that were superior to the mass market versions that followed? How many other brilliant inventions were created by refugees who had fled the conflict in Europe? Number 4. How do you save a wounded soldier's life on the battlefield? A soldier could bleed to death in minutes. Getting whole blood to the front lines was almost impossible. It needed to be refrigerated, it had a short shelf life, and it had to be typed and cross-matched for each patient. In the early days of the war, many wounded soldiers died from shock caused by blood loss before they could get proper medical care. A surgeon and medical researcher named Dr. Charles Drew revolutionized the process. In the late 1930s, he developed a method for processing and storing blood plasma. Plasma is the liquid component of blood. It can be separated from the red blood cells, dried into a powder, and stored for long periods without refrigeration. When it's needed, it can be reconstituted with sterile water and given to any patient, regardless of their blood type. A transfusion of plasma can't replace the oxygen-carrying red blood cells, but it can restore a patient's blood volume, preventing them from going into fatal shock. It buys precious time. In 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged, Drew was put in charge of a project called Blood for Britain. He organized a massive blood drive in New York City. He set up donor centers and implemented strict procedures for collecting and processing blood to create a supply of plasma for the British military. His system was incredibly efficient and effective. When the United States entered the war, Drew was made the director of the first American Red Cross blood bank. He scaled up his system to supply plasma to the U.S. military. His work saved an untold number of lives on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. He established the model for the modern blood banking system we have today. The idea of a centralized location for collecting, processing, and storing blood products was his creation. However, Dr. Drew's career was tragically cut short by the very prejudice he fought against. As an African American, he was forced to resign from his position at the Red Cross in 1942. The military had issued a directive that the blood of white and black donors had to be segregated. Dr. Drew protested this unscientific and discriminatory policy, and when it was upheld, he left. His genius had created a system to save the lives of soldiers, but the system itself was tainted by the racism of the era. He died in a car accident in 1950. His legacy is the entire field of modern blood storage and transfusion. But what other medical breakthroughs from the war were developed by scientists who faced discrimination and never received proper credit? How many lives were lost because of the unscientific policy of segregating blood? Are there still undiscovered components in blood plasma that could be used for new medical treatments? Number 3. Could a single machine break an unbreakable code? Modern warfare is a war of information. Knowing what your enemy is planning is the ultimate advantage. The German military had a powerful tool for protecting their communications. The Enigma machine, it was an electromechanical cipher machine that could scramble a message into what seemed like a random string of letters. The number of possible settings was astronomical, in the trillions. The code changed every day. The German high command believed it was unbreakable. The initial work on breaking the code was done by Polish mathematicians. Just before the invasion of Poland in 1939, they shared their work with the British. The British set up a top-secret code-breaking operation at a country estate called Bletchley Park. It was a collection of some of the brightest minds in the country, mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions. One of them was a brilliant and eccentric mathematician named Alan Turing. Turing and his colleagues realized that breaking the Enigma code by hand was too slow. The messages had to be deciphered in real time to be useful. They needed a machine to fight a machine. They developed a series of electromechanical devices called bombs. These machines could rapidly test thousands of possible Enigma settings, looking for a logical contradiction. They were essentially early single-purpose computers, but the Germans developed an even more complex cipher machine for their high-level communications, the Lorenz cipher. To break this code, the team at Bletchley Park, led by engineer Tommy Flowers, built something truly revolutionary. It was called Colossus. It was the world's first programmable electronic digital computer. Completed in 1943, Colossus used thousands of vacuum tubes. It could read a paper tape containing an encrypted message at high speed and perform logical operations to help decipher it. It wasn't a general purpose computer like the ones we have today. It was designed for one specific task, cryptanalysis. But it was a monumental leap in technology. The work at Bletchley Park was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. The intelligence they gathered, code-named Ultra, gave the Allies a crucial advantage. It helped them win the Battle of the Atlantic, prepare for the D-Day landings, and shorten the war by an estimated 2 years. After the war, Churchill ordered that all the Colossus machines and their blueprints be destroyed to protect the secret. The work of Turing, Flowers, and the thousands of others at Bletchley Park remained classified for decades. The principles they developed, using electronic circuits for logical operations, processing data at high speed, laid the groundwork for the post-war computer revolution. The ENIAC, often credited as the first general-purpose electronic computer, was built in the United States to calculate artillery firing tables, another wartime necessity. The computer on your desk, the phone in your pocket, the entire digital world we live in, has its roots in a secret British project to build a machine that could think. But what other technological secrets from that era remain classified or were lost forever when the Colossus machines were destroyed? How did the immense pressure of wartime code breaking accelerate the development of computer science by decades? If Alan Turing had not been persecuted for his homosexuality after the war, what other contributions might he have made to the world? Number 2, what does a bomber have to do with a vacation? The piston engine had its limits, it was complex, with hundreds of moving parts. Propellers became inefficient as they approached the speed of sound. To fly higher and faster, a new kind of engine was needed. The theory of jet propulsion had been around for a long time, but making it work was a different story. In the late 1930s, 2 engineers were working on the problem independently. In Germany, Hans von Ohain developed a jet engine that powered the world's first jet aircraft, the Heinkel He 178, in 1939. In Britain, a Royal Air Force officer named Frank Whittle had patented his own design for a turbojet engine in 1930. But he struggled for years to get funding and support. When the war began, the British government finally realized the military potential of his work. His engine powered Britain's first jet aircraft, the Gloucester E-20-839, in 1941. The first operational jet fighters, the German Messerschmitt Me 262 and the British Gloucester Meteor, saw limited action at the very end of the war. And they were a glimpse of the future of aviation. They were faster and could fly higher than any propeller-driven plane. They changed the face of aerial combat. After the war, the technology was no longer secret. The United States and the Soviet Union, using captured German research and their own developments, began a race to build jet-powered bombers and fighters. But the real revolution came in civilian aviation. In 1949, the British de Havilland Comet became the world's first commercial jet airliner. It was a marvel. It could fly higher and faster than any propeller plane, cutting travel times in half. Early jet travel was glamorous and expensive, but as the technology improved, planes got bigger, engines became more efficient, and the cost came down. The Boeing 707, introduced in 1958, is often credited with starting the jet age. It made international travel accessible to the middle class. A flight from New York to London that once took 18 hours in a propeller plane could now be done in under 7. The jet engine shrunk the world. It created the modern tourism industry. It connected economies and cultures. The engine that was designed to create a faster fighter plane ended up making it possible for you to take a vacation on the other side of the planet. But what if Frank Whittle had given up in the 1930s when he couldn't get funding? How much of the early success of jet aviation was based on captured German research? That is not widely acknowledged. Are there alternative, more efficient jet engine designs that were abandoned during the war in the race to develop a working model quickly? Number 1, can you turn the power of a star into a light bulb? It was the most secret project of the war. It was also the most ambitious. In 1939, a letter signed by Albert Einstein was delivered to President Roosevelt. It warned that German scientists were working on a new kind of bomb, one that could harness the power of atomic fission. It could be powerful enough to destroy an entire city. The United States had to get there first. This led to the creation of the Manhattan Project. It was a massive, top-secret undertaking that brought together the world's top physicists, chemists, and engineers. They worked in secret cities built in the middle of nowhere, like Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Their goal was to build a functional atomic weapon. The science was groundbreaking. They had to figure out how to sustain a nuclear chain reaction, how to enrich uranium, and how to produce plutonium. On July 16, 1945, at a test site in the New Mexico desert, they detonated the first atomic device. The project was a success. It produced the most destructive weapon ever created by humanity. It brought the war to a sudden and terrifying end. But the scientists who worked on the project also saw another possibility. The same incredible power that could be used for destruction could also be used for creation. The process of nuclear fission released a tremendous amount of heat. That heat could be used to boil water, create steam, and turn a turbine to generate electricity. It was the same principle as a coal or gas power plant, but the fuel source was millions of times more powerful. In 1951, a small experimental reactor in Arco, Idaho, produced the first usable amount of electricity from nuclear energy. It powered 4 light bulbs. It was a proof of concept. In his Atoms for Peace speech to the United Nations in 1953, President Eisenhower promoted the peaceful use of atomic energy. The first commercial nuclear power plant in the United States opened in Shippingport, Pennsylvania in 1957. Today, nuclear power plants generate about 10% of the world's electricity. It is a clean energy source, producing no greenhouse gases. The legacy of the Manhattan Project is complex and heavy. It gave humanity the power to destroy itself. But it also unlocked a fundamental force of the universe. It gave us a new powerful and controversial way to power our world. The same science that created the mushroom cloud also created the clean energy that might light your home. It is perhaps the most profound and difficult legacy of the War of Necessity, but what other scientific discoveries were made during the Manhattan Project that remain classified? How did the moral and ethical debates among the scientists working on the bomb shape the post-war world and the conversation around nuclear technology? Could the immense resources of the Manhattan Project have been used to develop a different, safer form of energy if the goal had been creation instead of destruction from the very beginning?